The powder magazine of the greatest treasure ship in the world had just exploded. Not from an enemy's careful aim, but from her own gun. One of the Ganj-i-Sawai's massive cannon burst apart on the very first volley, tearing through her own deck and turning her defenders into a screaming, panicked mass. And across the burning water, on a lean and hungry vessel called the Fancy, a man from a small English village watched the smoke rise and understood, in that single moment, that he was about to become the richest pirate who had ever lived. His name was Henry Every. And unlike almost every pirate you have ever heard of, this is the story of the one who won. You know the names. Blackbeard, with his burning fuses and his terrible end at Ocracoke. Kidd, hanged twice when the first rope snapped. Bartholomew Roberts, cut down on his own quarterdeck. The Golden Age of Piracy is a story of spectacular men and spectacular deaths. Nearly all of them ended the same way, dangling from a gibbet at the edge of some colonial harbor, tarred and chained as a warning to others. But there was one man who broke that pattern completely. One man who committed what was, in raw value, perhaps the single most profitable crime in all of recorded history, who triggered the first worldwide manhunt ever launched, and who then simply vanished from the pages of history without a trace. How he did it, and where he went, is a mystery we will reach before the end. But first, understand where this man came from, because nothing about his beginning suggested a legend. He was born around the year 1659, in the west country of England, most likely in the county of Devon, in the shadow of the sea. The details are thin, as they always are for men who were nobody before they became infamous. What we know is that he went to sea young and he learned it hard. He served in the Royal Navy. He worked the slaving routes off West Africa, a brutal trade that hollowed men out. By his early 30s he was a skilled sailor and a natural leader of rough men, and he carried a quiet, patient anger beneath a calm surface. Other sailors trusted him. That trust would soon cost an empire a fortune. In 1693, Henry Every signed on as first mate aboard a warship called the Charles II. She was part of a grand and legal venture, an expedition licensed to raid French shipping in the Caribbean. The men were promised good pay and a share of the plunder. Instead, the expedition fell apart before it even began. The ships sat anchored in the harbor of A Coruña, on the northern coast of Spain, for month after month. The Spanish paperwork never came. The financing stalled. And the crews, hundreds of ordinary sailors, went entirely unpaid. Weeks became months. Months stretched toward half a year. The men grew ragged and desperate. Some had families starving back in England. They begged the captains for even a portion of their promised wages, and they were refused, again and again. But there was a plan already forming in the dark below decks, and the men at its center had chosen their leader. We will see exactly what they decided shortly. First, feel the weight of that harbor. Cold rain. Rotting rope. Empty bellies and empty pockets. This was the soil in which mutiny grows. On the night of the 22nd of May, 1694, it happened. While the captain of the Charles II lay drunk and asleep in his cabin, the crews of several ships rose in coordinated rebellion. Henry Every was at the heart of it. The mutineers seized the vessel with barely a struggle. They offered the sleeping captain a choice: join us or be put ashore, and he chose the shore. And then, by the vote of the men, in the earliest tradition of pirate democracy, Henry Every was elected captain. His first act was to rename the ship. No longer the Charles II, a name that belonged to kings and merchants. From that night forward, she was the Fancy. And the Fancy would carry her crew into legend. Every was no fool with a stolen ship. He was a craftsman of the sea. He sailed the Fancy south, and along the way he stopped and had her rebuilt for a single purpose: speed. He ordered her upper decks cut down and her hull scraped clean, transforming a heavy warship into one of the fastest vessels on the ocean. He armed her with 46 guns. Word of his intentions began to spread among the desperate and the daring, and other men flocked to him. Soon the Fancy carried a crew of well over 150 hardened sailors, drawn from a dozen nations, bound by nothing but the promise of gold and the code they swore together. And here we must pause on that code, because Henry Every's articles are among the earliest pirate codes we have any record of. Every man aboard signed. The rules were simple and stark. Plunder would be divided fairly, with the captain taking only a modest extra share. Any man who deserted in battle, or who stole from his brothers, would face the judgment of the whole crew. It was, in its own grim way, a fairer arrangement than most of these men had ever known under king or company. They were outlaws now. But they were outlaws with a constitution. For a time, the Fancy prowled the coast of West Africa and the islands of the Atlantic, taking small prizes, gathering supplies, testing her speed. But Every was not interested in small prizes. He had heard the same rumor that drew pirates from across the world toward one narrow stretch of water. Every year, a great fleet sailed from the ports of India to the Holy City on the Red Sea and back again, carrying pilgrims and, more importantly, carrying the wealth of the wealthiest empire on earth. The Mughal Empire of India, under its Emperor Aurangzeb, was staggeringly rich, richer than any kingdom in Europe. And once a year, its treasure passed through a single choke point, the narrow strait at the mouth of the Red Sea. That is where Henry Every set his course. That is where everything would be decided. But hold that thought, because what waited for him there was larger and more dangerous than anything the Fancy had ever faced, and the outcome would hang on a single, almost unbelievable stroke of luck. By the summer of 1695, the Fancy had reached the strait, and Every found he was not alone. Word of the treasure fleet had drawn a small gathering of pirate ships to those waters, 5 other vessels, captains from the American colonies and the Caribbean, each hoping to seize a piece of the prize. Rather than fight one another, they formed a loose fleet, an alliance of thieves, and Henry Every, with the biggest and fastest ship, was its natural leader. Together they waited in the darkness near a barren island, watching for the lights of the Mughal convoy. And then, one night, the fleet came. Dozens of ships in the dark, and the pirates let most of them pass. They were waiting for the great ones. But in the confusion of the night, the largest treasure ships slipped by them in the blackness. When dawn broke, the pirates realized the prize had nearly escaped. They gave chase. Most of the pirate ships were too slow. But the Fancy was not. Cut down, scraped clean, built for exactly this moment, she ran the wind down and closed the gap mile after mile across the open Arabian Sea. They caught a straggler first, a large ship called the Fateh Muhammad. She surrendered after a brief fight, yielding a fortune in silver, enough to make every man aboard wealthy. But it was not the true prize. Somewhere ahead, still running, was the Emperor's own flagship, the greatest vessel of the entire Mughal fleet. Her name was the Ganj-i-Sawai, the exceeding treasure. And she was a floating fortress. Understand what Henry Every was chasing. The Ganj-i-Sawai was far larger than the Fancy. She carried perhaps 60 guns and hundreds of armed guards, a fighting force that outnumbered Every's crew several times over. By every measure of naval logic, the Fancy should have been torn apart. Every knew it. His men knew it. And they sailed straight at her anyway, because on the other side of that terror lay more wealth than any of them had ever dared to imagine. The two ships came together, and the battle began. And this is the moment everything turned. On the very first exchange of fire, one of the Ganj-i-Sawai's own great cannon burst. It exploded on her deck, killing her own gunners and throwing her defenders into chaos. And in that same instant, a shot from the Fancy found the enemy's mainmast and brought it crashing down. In 2 strokes of impossible fortune, the floating fortress was crippled. The pirates swept aboard. The fighting that followed was long and desperate, hand to hand across the ruined decks, and when it ended, the Ganj-i-Sawai belonged to Henry Every. What the pirates found in her hold defies easy description. Chests of gold and silver coin. Caskets of jewels, sapphires and rubies and diamonds. Vessels of gold. The personal wealth of the imperial court, gathered from the richest empire on earth. The total value has been argued over for 3 centuries, but the lowest estimates begin at 300,000 English pounds and the highest reach far beyond, a sum so vast that a single ordinary sailor's share could set him up as a gentleman for life. In the money of the modern world, the haul is measured in the tens of millions. It remains, by many reckonings, the single richest pirate prize ever taken. But wealth like that is never free, and the true price of the Ganj-i-Sawai was not paid on her decks. It was paid across 2 empires, and it would nearly change the course of history. Because among the passengers of that ship were people connected to the very court of the emperor, and what the pirates did to those captives during the days they held the ship was brutal and shameful, the details grim enough that we need not dwell on them here. But the news of it reached the Emperor Aurangzeb, and he was consumed with fury. Here is the part of the story that everyone leaves out. The consequences of that single act nearly destroyed the English presence in India entirely. The emperor did not know these were rogue pirates. He believed the English were responsible. In his rage, he shut down the trading posts of the English East India Company, threw its officials in prison, and threatened to expel the English from his lands forever, a loss that would have been catastrophic. The company, terrified, scrambled to save itself. It promised the emperor it would hunt down the men responsible whatever the cost. And so the Crown of England, pushed by the panicking company, did something that had never been done before in all of history. They put a price on Henry Every's head and sent word of it around the entire globe. A bounty, offered in every port and every colony, on every ocean. It was, by many accounts, the first truly worldwide manhunt in recorded history. One man, from a small village in Devon, had so enraged an empire and threatened a fortune that the whole reach of the English world was turned toward finding him. And this is where Henry Every does the thing that no other great pirate managed to do. He disappears. While the fleet scattered, the fancy turned and ran, all the way around the tip of Africa and across the Atlantic. Every knew the entire ocean would soon be looking for him. So he made for a place where the law was weak and men could be bought, the island colony of the Bahamas. There, the story goes, he offered the local governor a staggering bribe, the fancy herself and a fortune in gold and ivory, in exchange for safe harbor and no questions asked. The governor took the deal. And under that protection, Henry Every and his men melted away into the world, splitting the treasure and going their separate ways, each carrying a fortune and a secret. Some of them were not careful enough. A number of the crew were eventually tracked down in England and put on trial. The first jury, remarkably, refused to convict them, and the government, humiliated, arranged a second trial on different charges. Several men were hanged, made a public example to soothe the emperor's rage. But their leader, the man whose name was on every wanted notice from London to Bombay, was never among them. Henry Every was never caught. He was never hanged. He was never seen again by anyone who could prove it. So where did he go? Here we return to the mystery we opened at the start, and the honest answer is that nobody truly knows. Some accounts say he made his way quietly back to England or Ireland, living out his days under a false name, a wealthy ghost hiding in plain sight. One of the most enduring stories claims a darker, more fitting end, that he settled at last in the West Country where he was born, and tried to sell his fortune in diamonds to a group of merchants in Bristol, and that those merchants, knowing he could never go to the law, simply cheated him and kept the jewels for themselves. In that telling, the richest pirate in history died in poverty, robbed of everything, unable to prove he had ever owned a thing. But there is no grave, no record, no certainty. He simply steps out of history and is gone. And that absence became something more powerful than any confirmed death. Because Henry Every did not hang, he became a legend in his own lifetime, a symbol of the impossible dream. Ballads were sung about him in the taverns of England. Plays were written celebrating his escape. Stories spread that he had founded a secret pirate kingdom on a distant island, a free republic of outlaws where no king ruled and all men shared equally. It almost certainly never existed. But the fact that people believed it, that they wanted it to be true, tells you everything about what this one man came to represent. In an age when nearly every pirate ended his life kicking at the end of a rope, Henry Every was the one who got away, and for the desperate men who took up the black flag after him, That was the most dangerous idea of all, that it could actually be done. He inspired a generation. In the years after his vanishing, the Golden Age of Piracy exploded across the seas, and countless men who would become far more famous were chasing the dream he had made real. He showed them that an ordinary sailor from nowhere could steal an emperor's fortune and walk away into legend. Most would not be so lucky. Most would find the gibbet in the end. But they chased his shadow all the same. So when you think of the great pirates, remember the names that ended in fire and rope, and then remember the one that did not. A first mate who was cheated of his wages in a cold Spanish harbor, who took a ship and renamed her the Fancy, who chased an empire's treasure across the Arabian Sea and won it on a single burst of impossible luck, who triggered the first global manhunt in history, and who then closed the book on his own story and walked away forever. Henry Every. The pirate who was never caught. The one who got away. And somewhere out there, if the darkest version of the tale is true, a fortune in diamonds still lies scattered, unclaimed, in the hands of men who knew that the most feared pirate on earth could never come to collect.